Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on the Flux cast. I am Matt Chalmers, and with me today is...
Brianna Porter, how are we all?
Hey, Bri, how you doing today?
Good, very good.
That's great. That's great. So today's Flux cast, we want to talk about sterile compounding.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I I do like sterile compounding. I will admit, I really really like it. I
It's your
think it's
thing, isn't it?
look. I love it, and the thing is that it is a really interesting opportunity because I really think that it is underutilized in Australia.
Yeah.
I do. I really think that there is definitely room in the marketplace for more sterile compounding, but it has to be
Mm.
more competent sterile
Yeah,
compounding.
I was going to say, it's, more. We have to be careful about more.
Oh, look, I mean, it's like everything. There has to be a level of competency there.
Yeah.
The problem that we have here in Australia, I think, is that there's no real clear guideline.
No, it's very
And
scarce.
we're going to talk about that sort of at the end there about what is out there, but what traps are involved in that.
Mm.
But I would like to start by saying, I don't want this to I don't want people to think that we're saying, stay away from sterile compounding or anything like that, because I think that in the right hands with the right equipment and the right facilities,
Yeah.
it's a valuable thing,
You've got to be
and there
smart.
is room. Yeah, and there's room in the marketplace for it. Look, in Australia, my best guess on sterile compounders, and I don't want to use the term loosely. I mean, when we talk about compounding and we say that there's this many compounders in Australia, we talk about it. We use the term loosely. However, on this, I want to be pretty strict, and I would say that we wouldn't have any more than 10, 15.
Not pharmaceutical compounders, TGA compounders maybe, but not
Yeah,
pharmaceutical compounders.
sure. So, I think that there is space in the market there to engage in more compounding,
Mm.
more sterile compounding. I would say that is something that the regulators don't necessarily agree
No,
with.
I was going to say I think there has been a massive jump in the demand for sterile compounders recently due to some of the big guys closing down.
Yeah, yeah,
And that was a big part in due to their sterile practices
yeah,
or
yeah, and
concerns over their sterile practices, I should say.
sure. The idea that it scares the regulators so much. I mean, we don't want to dwell on it too much, but
No.
there's a very very clear example that everyone seems to point to, which is the New England Compounding Center in Massachusetts in the USA.
Yes.
I believe the numbers got up to 88 dead and
It was just awful.
thousands more
Injured.
permanently incapacitated. Yeah, it was a rough go. I would if you don't know about that, I mean, look, it's flogging a dead horse now. This
I
is
was going to say,
it's
how
not.
many years ago did that
Yeah,
happen
it
now?
was, well, it was 2012, I believe. So,
Far out.
9 years ago now,
Mm.
coming up on 10. And I would encourage you to go and have a look. If you don't know much about this, believe it or
Mm.
not, Newsweek did a really good article on it. And I'm going to put it in the description, a link to that in the description, because it's still up. And it talked a lot about the problems that they had there. Now, interestingly, they did have a lot of problems that we just would not encounter here in Australia.
Yeah.
One of their biggest things was they had zero recall ability because they were backdating prescriptions, because they were accepting prescriptions for Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse and
Oh. It's
all those
just.
sorts of things. It was a disaster from top to bottom.
It was a clear. It was a clear. They were doing things incorrectly on purpose. It
Yeah,
wasn't. We didn't know better. It wasn't like they were just. It was actually quite brazen. The crap that they were doing.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's
Look,
amazing they got away with it as long as they did.
as I said, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but one
Yeah.
thing that is interesting is that they were sterilizing, they were autoclaving their product, um, the one that caused all these problems.
Mm.
And what they were actually doing was they were running their autoclave cycle 9 minutes less than recommended for
Yep.
every batch, so that they could fit in another
More.
batch at the end of the day.
Far out.
That's the level that we're dealing with here.
Yep.
So like I said, go and have a read of this Newsweek article. I'll drop it in the description. It does really cover the whole circumstance quite nicely, and you can see what it is about sterile compounding that scares the crap out of our Australian regulators.
Yeah, when you read stories like that, you go, like, why is anybody doing sterile compounding? Like, it's a scary story. The numbers are insane. And like you said, the numbers even themselves, they're probably not something we would ever encounter in Australia.
Yeah.
Like, the level of damage and everything was, the output and the financial numbers and everything was just insane.
Yeah. And now, I mean, at the time when they arrested the fellow that owned it, they still have the death penalty on the books in Massachusetts, and they were talking about calling for it. In the end, I believe he got
14 years, I think it was.
Yeah.
But plus $82 million restitution, $1.4 million in damages.
Yeah.
So he's done.
So, I mean, we started talking about Sterile in this vein after there was an AJP article talking about a rash of closures.
Yes.
What did that say? Tell us about that.
So with the article, they went into the fact that there had been an uptick in complaints around eye drops. So there was a whole bunch of places that were getting closed or cautioned or conditioned because they were doing eye drops outside of a sterile environment. Now, this is something that back in the day that would have been done. You got a commercial product and you had to mix it with your sterile water, and it was done on the backbench. But that was a long time ago. We know better now. Science has progressed and we understand the risks and everything that go along with it. So it has been something that I don't know if people don't realise that eye drops needed to be sterile or what it was, whether they just didn't care. But all of these places, that was kind of became a thing that the regulators looked at. They went, okay, do you do eye drops? And so they were picking up people on doing these sort of things outside of a sterile environment. Right. So, eye drops are one thing. You've got, things like injections and IVs are obvious that they're sterile. They're sterile medicines. You've got things like irrigations, your ophthalmic dose forms, anything for pulmonary inhalation as well. So no nasal sprays don't count, but anything for inhalation, so like nebulizers and things like that, that needs to be sterile. So there's a lot of different things that are out there, and these are things that are generally restricted to the more innovative and sterile facilities, but you do occasionally get the people that go, well, I can do an inhalation. You breathe air. You're not injecting it. What's the difference? But you're breathing it into your organs, like directly into your lungs. There's lots of things that can go wrong there. So vapes is another one, actually, on that topic for inhalations. Vapes are now on prescription.
So Greg Hunt got his wish.
Yeah. So if you're doing a prescription vape, that needs to be sterile.
Right. Right. Okay. Because I guess that you know what, that raises a very interesting point. I guess that there is now, because there's no, if it's by prescription, it'll need to be either a TGA registered product or compounded.
Correct.
Ooh. Okay. Wow. That's a very interesting point. I would think that that would be something that people would be jumping on.
It's definitely been coming up in circles that I've been talking with, and there's a bit of chatter going around.
Right.
But yeah, it's one of those things. Like I said, it may not be bleedingly obvious that you might need to do it in a sterile environment.
Yeah.
So it's it's a new opportunity, but we still need to look at all the risks that are associated with it. And that's a big part with sterile compounding, is just about the risk.
Yeah.
And that's why it becomes so specialist and why it becomes so stringent, because of the risk.
Right. Look, I would be very surprised if someone doesn't fall foul of that, essentially the jury's still out on whether vaping is better than cigarette smoking or whatever, but
I don't know how it could be good for you regardless.
Well, the bottom line is, though, that it is nicotine. It's an addictive substance, and what you're doing is you're giving you're essentially filling a script for an addictive substance and compounding it. I don't know how regulators are going to look favorably upon that.
That just sounds like a risk management nightmare to me. Like that gives me... Ugh. That gives me the heebie-jeebies. There are so many things that can go wrong.
So tell me, what's the difference between sterile and aseptic?
So your aseptic, you use aseptic technique in sterile compounding still. But aseptic compounding is when you start from a sterile starting material. So with sterile starting materials, aseptic technique is paramount because you're depending on the sterility and you need to maintain the sterility using your aseptic technique. While you still use aseptic technique for sterile compounding can actually start from non-sterile ingredients. The way that you ensure sterility on those sort of products is terminal sterilization. So putting it through a filter, an autoclave or an oven, that kind of thing, depending on the product and their chemical properties, you select the most appropriate. I know I have spoken to people in the past, though, that argue that sterilization by filtration isn't necessarily terminal sterilization.
Right.
So if you're using filtration as your terminal sterilization, you've kind of got two processes in place then. So you've got your sterile compounding from a non-sterile starting material. It goes through the filter and creates a sterile product. And then from that sterile product, you're further manipulating into your vials or syringes or whatever you're putting them into. And so from there, it's an aseptic technique. So you've got a combination of the two in that instance.
Right.
So, but it's not necessarily something that's it's not documented. It's not a standard or anything like that. But by logic, that's what you've got in that sort of instance. So there is a difference between the two. There's a difference in risks that are associated with that. Obviously, for aseptic, you don't have, or you don't necessarily have the risk of contamination from the product itself.
Yep.
Whereas with your non-sterile starting materials, you have the risk of there being something, endotoxins, that kind of thing could be in the starting material. Yeah. We had an instance, I think it was about 7 years ago now, it was a while ago, where there was a recall on a glutathione product, which was from a manufacturer in China, and they had high levels of endotoxins. And it put a few people in the hospital. Luckily, nobody died or was seriously injured, but there were a few people that had to go and get some medical attention. Yeah. So, and that was from, a non-sterile starting material. So there is a risk there with the materials themselves, and the difference between aseptic and sterile compounding is that risk level. Yeah. And I look, I remember that incident, and I remember the pharmacy council sort of pointing at that and going, see, yeah. we told you, we always said that this would happen. Well, that was when the pharmacy board released their first version of the guidelines, if you remember.
That's right, yeah.
They just went, oh crap, here, look, there's guidelines. Look, you need to read those guidelines, and if you don't do that, then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
because at that time, there was no guidelines. Yeah. There was, I think, maybe 6 pages in the APF, which weren't up to date with complex compounding, or sterile for that matter. They don't really talk about sterile much now. So yeah, it was an interesting time. Very interesting time.
Well, I mean, it's kind of what brought about the big changes that we're seeing now.
Yeah, that's it. It really was the catalyst for everything.
Yeah. So when do you need special facilities then? Because we talked about, it used to be on the back bench or whatever. I mean, now not acceptable in 2021. When are you going to need those special facilities?
So if you're
I want you, while you're answering this, I want you to think about it, because I'm going to ask you what those special facilities should be, and we're going to run down a list.
How long have we got for this thing?
But when do you need those special facilities?
So for sterile compounding, you need to have sterile facilities if you're doing injections, infusions, irrigations, ophthalmic dosage forms, your pulmonary inhalations, implants. Implants is one that you don't see a lot in Australia, but there are a couple of places around that have them now.
Yeah.
So that's one, it's being inserted under the skin, so it really needs to be sterile. Anything that's going to be going into like a cavity within the body, basically. If it's being put direct, like not things like your stomach, because your stomach has the capability to destroy certain bugs, right? That's our first line of defense sometimes is our stomach acid. But if you're injecting something, you're bypassing that stomach acid or the filtration through the liver or anything like that. So we don't have that line of defense that you would have from pathogens going through an oral route of administration. Things that go into like irrigations or things that go into your mouth or rectal cavity, sinus cavity, those sort of things don't need to be sterile. But yeah, anything that's going to be going into like the peritoneal cavity or anything like that really needs to be, or straight into your bloodstream, needs to be sterile.
Okay. Just to go back to what you said about our stomachs being our first line of defense, I want to, and I'll put a link to this in the description too. There's a great book called "That's Disgusting" by Rachel Hertz. And and it talks about the science of disgust and how we get disgusted and how it was, it's evolved from a safety mechanism into what is now in our day-to-day dealings, and it shapes our the way that we interact and our culture and society and where it comes from in the brain and all that sort of thing. It's a fascinating book.
I think I need to read that one. That sounds cool.
Yeah. I'll put a link to that. I'll put a link to that in the description. It's it was a great book, very interesting, very interesting, very scientific. Yeah, really, really fascinating stuff. So let's talk about the facilities that are required.
Yes.
Do you want to go in order from most expensive to least expensive, or look, by no means is this an exhaustive list.
No.
Let's preface this by saying, off the dome, what are we looking at here, and let's try and go from most expensive to least expensive.
Yeah, so like straight up, you've got your environment that you're working, the room, the facilities. You need to have segregation from other activities in the pharmacy. You should be having segregation from other activities in the pharmacy with compounding anyway, but with sterile, you go through levels of air quality. So, the air around us is a source of pathogens, of, bugs and microbes and all that sort of stuff. So we need to be working in a space where that air is being filtered. So that means having HEPA filters on your aircon systems, but also you need to level down in each space. So you can't go straight from, your lunchroom into an ISO 5 airspace.
Right.
Because when you open that door, you introduce air.
Sure.
So the way that classified air works is that it steps down in classifications as you go through. So for a sterile facility, you will have some sort of preparation room, you'll have an ante room, and this is where people can get changed into the appropriate garb, but it also gives the air pressure a chance to change.
Right.
So in that space, so you might go from an unclassified area into an ISO 8 area. So each ISO classification has different levels of particles in the air that are acceptable. And this gets, you do classifications through an external supplier. So they'll come in with a machine, they do particle counts on the air, and depending on what, filters and things you have in the air control systems, that will make a difference to the quality of the air.
Right.
There's, particular numbers of air changes per hour, all that sort of stuff. So it's, just the aircon unit for one of these facilities is super involved.
Right.
One of the ways to get around having a full sterile step-down system is to have an isolator. So an isolator is a primary engineering control, like a powder containment hood.
Right.
But slightly different. It's one of the ones you probably see them on, ads and things and movies and whatever. If they're working in a lab and they've got the big gloves that go through into the big glass box, that's an isolator.
Yep.
So there are instances where you can work in an unclassified area in an isolator and it's still sterile. But I guess that's a whole other thing on its own.
Sure.
That's, hours and hours of workshops and things like that. So, but yeah, so you've got the air control and the actual design of your rooms is probably the biggest expense, biggest step. Next would be your primary engineering controls. So whether you've got an isolator or a laminar flow hood. So with your powder containment hoods that you use, they suck air in. So the air goes from where you're sitting and it sucks air back across the hood to the filters at the back. It goes up into the filtration to spit out the top is the general gist of it. And that's because it protects the operator from the product. So by sucking air in, it stops any of the particles of the product getting out of the hood. Right. In the case of sterile, we don't want air in the hood because that's going to suck microbes from outside the hood into the product.
Ah, right, yes.
So for those kind of products, you need the air to spit out of the hood. In some instances, if you've got a hazardous product, you don't want it spitting air out. So you need both. So to do that, it's a curtain system basically. So it's got an air curtain that goes straight down the front of the hood to sort of segregate the areas. And then I believe it sucks the air back. So it's got curtain down the front, air back across the hood. Right. To protect the product and the operator. So you'd be using that for things like hormone injections. Would need to have a system like that, or an isolator, something that completely protects both operator and personnel. Operator and product.
Yeah. So any hazardous material, hormones, cytotoxics,
all those sort of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Cytotoxics have other requirements again for the room. Because
Well,
that becomes a whole works health safety thing. There's all sorts of stuff.
Okay.
So so that's probably the next most expensive thing. And besides the hoods, a chair for somebody to sit on, maybe a metal trolley to have your products on, you shouldn't have anything else in that room.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so
very sparse.
Very sparse. No radios, no, all that sort of stuff. I know a lot of compounding places might use a walkie-talkie if they need to communicate with the person in the sterile room.
Yep.
But, no music playing. The person in there needs to be garbed up so that there's no skin exposed to the air as well. Because, I say this a lot, but humans are the biggest source of risk when it comes to all of this, whether it's technique or procedure. But in the case of sterile compounding, we're just a massive lump of microbes. Yeah. Our skin depends on microbes to be healthy. Yeah. So, there is a risk there that just being there, we don't even have to touch anything to start anything, just being there, talking. Every time you talk, stuff comes out of your mouth. So, making sure that we're wearing appropriate masks, but also, not talking too much when you're in there. So really the best way to do sterile compounding is no contact. If you've got somebody who's in the sterile room, they need to be left alone. They don't talk to anybody, no singing while you're working. I don't know if I'd be able to do a sterile job.
I was just thinking, well, that cuts out my career as a sterile technician. That's that.
So lots of these things that you just, you can't have. You don't want to have too much paper in there. I know I've seen facilities where they might have like a storage of syringes and stuff that they use in the sterile area, but you don't want to be storing stuff in there. So really, if you're going to be using syringes for a product, they need to come through when you come through to make the product. Right. It needs to be take in only what you need, no more, no less. Yeah. So there's not a whole lot you need in there other than what you're working on. But they, it needs to be nice and clean and sparse.
Okay. A crucial step in sterile compounding is, of course, risk assessment. Flux Pharma's CPD education has dedicated a whole volume of our program to risk assessment. What it is, the risk management cycle, personnel risk, and perhaps most beneficially, practical demonstrations of risk assessment documentation, as well as a few templates to set up your own program in your pharmacy. Find all of this and more in Volume 2 of the Flux Pharma QA Education Program. Visit fluxpharma.com.au and begin your journey toward better quality management today. Let's get back to the show.
Now, look, there sounds like there's a lot of training involved in this sort of thing.
Yes.
Where does someone get training? Who does anyone offer sterile training?
I think occasionally the guys at Medisca do run a sterile course. They have like an introduction to sterile compounding. I don't know how often that runs because I guess the issue with that sort of thing is, how many people need it? Yeah. For them to run a course, it's expensive. So if they don't get enough people, is it worth their while running it in the first place? So that's a big issue. Okay. With external training and learning, things like that. You get a lot of compounding technicians that I've met that do sterile have actually worked for Big Pharma.
Right.
So they have experience in, places like, where did they work? It starts with an A. It's escaping me now. But, big pharma companies, or Baxter. Baxter's another one that does sterile compounding. So they'll have experience in these facilities, which are they're GMP facilities. Mm-hmm. So if you can find yourself someone like that for your sterile compounding, winning.
Yeah, okay.
But once you've got them, you need to continually, like with any kind of compounding, you've got to do continual training. You've got to do continual competency evaluation. With sterile compounding, you need to be doing your own media fill assessments for technicians. So basically that tests their aseptic technique.
Yes.
And which sounds like a simple task, but you would be surprised the number of people that fail. It's actually amazing the number of people that don't pass.
So so let's take a step back. Yeah. How is that performed? How is that measured?
Media fill?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have a medium, which is usually a broth of some description, an agar or something like that. And they come, and you can actually buy media fill kits.
All right, I'm with you so far. Broth, good. Yep.
Yeah, let's see how far we get through.
Okay.
And so you have bottles, and you have to transfer. I know I did it in microbiology at uni.
Right.
You transfer using different utensils depending on what processes you're using in the pharmacy. So, like with any sort of assessment of competence or validation, you need to sort of use the worst case scenario. So if you're going to be doing a run of 25 units, you want to do a media fill of 25 units. Mm-hmm. And you need to transfer the broth or whatever it is from one vessel to another using your process that you would normally do for compounding.
Right. And
then that transferred vial will be incubated for a certain amount of time. I think it's at 28 degrees for 30 days and then maybe 30 for another 2 weeks maybe. From memory, off the top of my head. But you need to incubate it for a certain amount of time and see if anything grows.
Right.
You can actually get some media fill kits which will change colour. So if there is something growing in it, it'll change to pink. So it's easy for you to see. So you don't have to send it off to get tested or anything like that. But you can just see that something's grown, so it didn't work.
Right.
So, it doesn't necessarily matter what grew. It just matters that something grew. We don't want anything to grow.
Okay. And so how often are you supposed to be doing this media fill competency assessment? So
competency for sterile stuff should be every 6 months at the moment.
Right.
There is
and this is per person working in the room, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. Every technician. So they need to be doing the media field. They need to be doing a didactic test as well. So a written competency assessment.
Right.
And a gowning assessment. So making sure that when they garb up, that they're not touching certain parts of their garb with their bare hands. Right. There's actually a really cool video. You might be able to put the link in the description for me because I don't know how to do that. But
I'll put the link in the description.
But it's a really cool video. It shows how you garb up correctly using Sterile, because even to the point where the order in which you put your garb on is important. You know, you have to put on the dirtiest parts first. I think it is. But, you know, you gown up in a certain order. And then even when you're putting your gloves on, there's a special technique for putting on sterile gloves, which is really cool. So, but it ensures that you don't...
Can you describe it?
You just don't touch the outside of the gloves.
Oh, okay.
So there's certain ways. So with sterile gloves, the way they're packaged, they'll usually have a cuff folded over. Mm-hmm. So you can pick up the first glove using the cuff. So your bare hand or your gloved hand with regular gloves touches the inside of the glove only. When you pick it up by the cuff, you put that sterile one on using the cuff. And then using that sterile glove, you pick up the other glove from the outside of the glove, so only sterile's touching sterile, and put your other glove on. Right. It's really hard to describe it, but the video shows it really well. Okay. So we'll link it. But so you have to do your assessment to make sure that people know how to get dressed properly. So
is that every 6 months, or is that...
That's every 6 months. Yeah.
Wow.
Because of the risk level with sterile compounding, you need to make sure that your staff are competent on a more frequent basis. Mm-hmm. You know, general competency once every year is the recommendation. But yeah, because sterile is a higher risk, you know, if you do have somebody who forgets how to do something after a few months, that could end up like New England. You know, it could be a big issue.
And so what is the, is there any sort of competency assessment for, you know, potency, or do you not sort of worry about that in sterile?
You still need to do, you know, some sort of...
Or do you cover that in your general?
That's in your general. So when you're compliant with 797, which is the sterile compounding standard for USP, you must comply with 795 first. So it's not an either or situation.
Okay.
So it's basically 795 is for all compounders. It doesn't matter what kind of compounding you're doing. You need 795. That is the general compounding standard.
Yep.
Then 797 is an add-on. So whatever you do in 797 is in addition to 795. Mm-hmm. So they do, you know, obviously adjust frequencies and things like that. For example, with training, cleaning is a lot more in depth for sterile.
Right.
You know, the types of things that you clean with, all of that is a lot more specific. Mm-hmm. So it's an addition to 795.
Right.
So all of that stuff about, you know, the potency testing or you know, validation of stuff for other compounding SOPs, or, you know, requiring prescriptions, all that sort of stuff, that all still applies in sterile.
Okay.
So, but the frequency, I actually thought was really interesting in the proposed changes for 797. They've actually changed their recommendation in 797 about how often you should be doing training and competency. Okay. So they've got a few different categories. So they classify sterile compounding in regards to risk. So there's category 1, 2, and 3, and depending on the level of controls that you have in place and the types of products, etc., there's different categories. Category 1 being the lowest, and that one is the one, it's considered it's the lowest category, but it's also the highest risk. So you can't really put a long expiry on those. Up to category 3, which is quite controlled, it's still high risk because it's sterile. But it's more controlled, so there's a bit more leeway on how much expiry date you can put on a product. Because, you know, I think we all know in compounding, it kind of all comes down to what expiry date can we put on these products.
Yeah, that's been a big issue lately.
but it's always been around. It's always, how much longer can I make the expiry? Like, what's the max that I can do?
Yeah. Sorry about my dog in the background again. I promise one day we're going to get through one of these without my dog in the background.
Roxy the guard dog is just doing her job. So, so they've got these 3 different categories, but
now the other dog's joined in. And I might just mute myself there. You go ahead.
So the recommendations on how often we should be doing the training and competency assessment does differ based on the categories that they have assessed. So for categories 1, I think it's 1 and 2, they say, once every 6 months still. But if it's category 3, where we are doing a longer expiry especially, we want to be doing every 3 months, they say. So I guess that comes down to what your risk appetite is as well, because it might be that you don't think 6 months is enough. You might want to do it every 3 months. You might see there's a higher risk, it all depends on, what your environment is. Are you working in an unclassified environment? So is that higher risk? Are you working in a very nice, shiny facility that's got all the beautiful classified areas and equipment and everything that you need? So you think, oh, look, I've got all of these things in place. My risk is a lot lower. So I'm happy with 6 months. But I feel like when I'm talking about sterile, it's risk over and over again. What's the risk? What's the risk? How do we manage the risk? Right. And that's just what it comes down to. Sterile is a higher risk product. Yeah. So.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's talk about 797.
Yeah.
Okay. And we're kind of getting to the end here, but let's talk about 797.
Yep.
Because obviously the pharmacy board has said 797 is the standard. This is what everyone's got to go to. But there are traps there.
Yes.
Which, as we know, and as a lot of listeners will know, a lot of people have sort of fallen foul of that.
Yeah.
I would let's start with, just give me the brief overview 797. What it covers, where it comes from.
So USP is it's a compounding standard written by the United States Pharmacopoeia. Mm-hmm. There's a committee for compounding, and it includes stakeholders from the industry. So it's based in the US. It is an international standard now. It's accepted all over because they're basically the only pharmacopoeia that has practice standards. Yep. So most pharmacopoeias, you're probably familiar with the name USP or BP or EP in relation to the quality of a material. Mm-hmm. So, pharmacopoeias will lay out monographs for products, for finished products, as well as raw materials. But the USP also has this section on practice standards. And it's a big document. I think it's about 460 pages. It's a very in-depth, in comparison to our APF, it's at maybe up to 12 or 13 now pages. Right. So so USP, it's a lot more in depth. It goes into a bit more detail around different practice, expiry dates. So I know that's been something that's come up a lot recently about, assigning expiry dates according to USP. It's always been something that the APF has allowed until the APF 25 change. But it gives a nice general guidance on how to assign expiry dates. Mm-hmm. So 795, there's a whole lot of different chapters. 795 is your general chapter. So that's if you're doing non-sterile only, that's the one that you look at. And It goes through all the different things that you need for a quality management system. It talks about documentation. It talks about staff training. It talks about quality control checks, all that sort of thing. But 797 is your sterile component. And there's a whole lot of associated chapters that go along that around sterility testing, around endotoxin testing, and a whole lot of other stuff. So it's not just 797. When you read 797, you'll see it refers to, I think it's 1162 and all these other ones that are around testing requirements. But that's one you only really see in 797, not so much 795.
Mm-hmm.
So as I said before, you have to comply with 795 to comply with 797. The Pharmacy Board guidelines have said to compounders, okay, sterile compounding, they've got one section in the guidelines about sterile compounding.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically says either comply with PICS, which is your TGA standard, and I don't think is feasible for a pharmacy to be able to achieve a TGA license. And then you've got USP 797, which is your compounding standard, which is a more appropriate standard, but they allow you to select the one that's more appropriate for your practice. So based on that, you have to do a self-assessment. You can get an external auditor to come and check your compliance, but the Pharmacy Board expects you to do your own auditing. They're not going to audit it. They don't have people to come and look at it. You might have the regulators might ask you questions about it occasionally, but there's nobody dedicated. And look, let's be honest, there's nobody dedicated for assessing compounders from the regulators specifically.
Yeah.
There are inspectors for all the different regulators, and they have some knowledge of what they're looking for, but there's no dedicated compounding committee or anything here.
No, sure, yeah.
So USP, it's been around for, I think, since the 1800s. It's an old institution.
Right.
And they're always updating their standards and everything, and they did try and do an update in 2019. But that had a bit of a false start, unfortunately. There was a lot of unanswered questions and concerns around stability and things like that. So they still haven't changed over to the new version.
Right.
They released a proposed changes document in September this year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's been a while. They've done public consultations. They've done all sorts of reviews and things like that using all their different stakeholders.
Is that available for, can anyone view that?
Yeah, it is. It's on the USP website, usp.org.
That's all right. We'll put a link in the description.
Gosh, you guys are getting filled up with links this week. It's all good stuff. All good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can have a look there and it'll go through the different changes that they're proposing at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few things, like the categories for one is one that sticks out to me as a big change for Sterile. Before they had the risk levels as low, medium and high risk.
Mm-hmm.
So with the new version, they actually took it out completely.
Right.
So the proposed revisions, they've now put the categories back in, but they haven't called them low, medium and high risk. They've just called them category 1, 2 and 3. So, and it's based off the number of controls that you have rather than the products themselves. So before, the risk levels were based on, number of products that you're making at a time. It was based on the type of product, I think. It was based on it was based on the environment to an extent as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a few different things, and then based on that, they said, okay, you can have it stored for 24 hours or 48 hours. And I think that's something that might shock a few compounders out there, is that the expiry dates that they're putting on these things are not we're not talking 6 months. We're not talking, we're talking 24 hours still. Yeah. If you've got a category 1 with, very little controls, you've got max, I think it's 12 or 24 hours. It's an immediate use situation.
Yeah. Okay.
So category 3 has a bit more leeway, and they go into a bit more detail based on formulation and things like that as to where you can extend expiry dates.
Mm-hmm.
And they also base extension of expiry dates on testing. So, you know, you can't extend without having sterility testing. Even if you've done all the right things, you've terminally sterilized, that sort of thing, unless you can guarantee that you have actually sterilized it, you probably won't get more than 48 hours.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Now, we do talk about PBA adopting 797, but there's traps.
Oh, yeah.
There's traps in Australia for that.
Yeah. They haven't really thought it through, I don't think. Like, they just went, oh, there's a standard there, great. But they don't understand that you need 795 in order to have 797.
Which they don't require.
which they don't require 795.
Yeah.
So there's that gap straight away.
Mm-hmm.
I know one that I've spoken to quite a few compounders and had some robust discussions around is batching. You know, the big bad...
Well, we talked about that last week or the week before. And,
that's it. The big bad B word.
Yeah.
You know, we know that in Australia, we can't compound in anticipation. We can't batch. But to comply with 797, you know, there are some requirements around, unless you're doing, 48-hour expiry date, you need to have sterility testing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how are you going to make something in advance, not make something in advance, and, wait 2 to 3 weeks for sterility testing turnaround that you may or may not get more than 48 hours expiry date on? Like, it's, to me, you'd want something to have sterility data before using it.
Yeah.
It would be better.
Especially if if you're talking about IV or something, high hazard like that.
Yeah, that's it. But but I feel like the way that it's done and, the not being able to compound in anticipation or batching, it just encourages pharmacists not to do it.
Yeah.
And, it's hard to comply with 797 without that batching or compounding in anticipation.
Because 797 allows for it.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. That's it. Exactly. But they have stopgaps. Like, they have things in there to protect patients based on batching.
Yeah.
They have limits on, if it's under this, if it's over this number of units for this number of patients, then you have to do these tests. If it's over this number, you have to do these tests. It's not just, they haven't just gone, just go make whatever you want. That's fine. They have actually put some more thought into it. Not just made a blanket rule and gone, they'll sort themselves out.
Yeah.
So there is a bit of a, contradiction. I know working on pharmacies with their processes, and they go, okay, well, we have to do this, this, and this, and this is how we're going to manage doing the sterility testing.
Yeah.
And you go, well, you can't batch. And you go, but I need to batch to be able to comply with that part of 797. So the guidelines says to us, you can't batch. The guidelines say to us, comply with 797. So what do? What one trumps the other? It's not very clear. And I've gone around in circles for hours with pharmacists on this.
Yeah.
It's just, what is the rule that comes out on top? Either you comply with 797 so you comply with 797 and you're in breach of the batching rule, or you follow the batching rule and you don't have the ability to comply with 797. Yeah. It's a bit of a tricky trap there.
Yeah. That's a big trap. That's a big trap that a couple of people have fallen into.
Trying to do the right thing to comply with 797 and get the sterility testing done, but as a result have made in anticipation, even if it's based on years and years of data. It's still in anticipation. So, that's like we talk about easy gets from these regulators. That's an easy get.
Yes.
Straight up. Especially with the big ones, they just assume that big guys are doing it.
Yeah.
So they just go straight in there and go, you.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to end on this. I want to end on this question.
Is this another impromptu one that you're going to catch me out on, and I have to think of?
No. I just no, not at all.
What's the meaning of life, Bri?
Yeah. Well, we know that it's 42. Actually that was released, I think it was 50 years ago, just the other day. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yeah. So I would like to ask you, what are the attributes of a successful sterile pharmacist?
Of a sterile pharmacist?
Yes.
Super risk averse. Someone who checks the street 20 times before crossing it.
Yep. Okay.
Somebody who's completely anal.
Yep.
You need to be very, 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 very particular. And process driven. Yep. Not that I'm biased or anything, but process is a big part, and you have to stick to those processes exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that would be my biggest things, and inspector detector pharmacists.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Who assume that everything will go wrong.
Okay. The more scared you are as a pharmacist, the better off you're going to be as a sterile compounder.
More than likely, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right. Yeah.
Because you'll take that extra time to consider the risks and to put things in place to make sure that you're going to be okay.
Okay. Well, if you're listening to this and you're a pharmacist that doesn't like horror movies and jumps at shadows, consider Sterile.
Come talk to us. Don't talk to me. I don't want to talk about Sterile.
All right, then. Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks, Bri.
Wonderful. Talk to you soon. Bye, guys.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.